The subject for tonight is compromise. What is it? When is it good? One place where you perhaps unwittingly mention compromise 3 times a day is where we pray for the restoration of justice. And we ask for Yeshivat Shovteinu kabarishona v'yotzenu kavatchila. Restore our judges as it was before and our advisors. Now, if we're praying for the restoration of the courts and the application of justice, it's not clear why you should include advisors there. And one explanation, based on our courtroom practice, is that when 2 litigants come before the court, they want to have their claims heard, and each one is sure he's going to win because he's right. The first thing that the court does is try to influence them to compromise. One procedure that's used, because it's known, isn't very effective, but it is used, one of the judges will take one of the litigants aside and say, listen, I've looked over the basic claims in this case. I want you to know that there are 3 major opinions that oppose your position. And he's telling the truth. Meanwhile, one of the other judges takes the other litigant aside and says, I want you to know, I looked over the claims in this case, and there are 3 major opinions that oppose your position. And they're not making this up because it's a controversial case. And then the judge says to the litigant, you know, maybe you should consider compromise, because if you push it to the wall, you may lose everything. In this way, each one is given an incentive to make a compromise, because the best outcome is that there should be a compromise. Now, why is that? After all, this is a court of law. It could very well be that if they would argue their cases, the law would say one is right and one is wrong. Why is it the best outcome if they compromise? One of the main reasons, and easy reason to understand, is consider the consequences of following the law and deciding that Reuven is right and Shimon is wrong. Shimon's going to be unhappy. And there'll be a great temptation for Shimon to figure out some way in which he's being cheated. And he may come to doubt the honesty of the court, or if he's more cautious, he may just doubt the legal ability of the court, reasoning ability. He may put it down to prejudice. He may become rebellious against Torah authority on the grounds that he didn't get a fair deal in his eyes. Compromise preserves peace. Yes, each person is somewhat disgruntled that he didn't get everything he wanted. But on the other hand, he freely agreed to the compromise, and he did get something of what he wanted. And life isn't ideal, you know. You have to take the good with the bad with the good, and you have to sometimes be content with getting less than you wanted. The probability of serious spiritual consequences of compromise is much lower than the serious spiritual consequences of Yikov Zadin Sahar. Let the judgment pierce the mountain and just going for the straightforward judgment. So we pray for the restoration of judges and counselors who can lead us to make a decision that will produce a better outcome often than simply looking for justice. Of course, whether the outcome is better or not means you have to take into account all of its consequences. Okay, so compromise, at least in this circumstance, means giving up on some of your claim, giving up on some of your goal, and it's definitely appropriate, and we can see more or less why. Now, how can we generalize it? Is it always right in a conflict to give up a part of your goal? Does it depend upon what kind of goal it is, how important it is, or what status it has for the rest of your identity? Is there any general rule saying, well, it's for this sort of thing, yeah, you could compromise up to 40%. And if it's that sort of thing, you compromise up to 70%. And if that's kind of thing, you don't compromise at all. There you have to hold fast. It can't be negotiated at all. I think that if you're looking for a general rule, externally, philosophically, morally, it's going to be very difficult. Especially when we take into account some of the things that we see in the Torah. So here's an example of something where you might thought you would infer a rule from it, but I think it doesn't work. Saul is king, and he has some unfortunate interactions with David, who later becomes king, and he's sent to destroy the Amalekites, and he fails to do so, fails to complete the job. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Shmuel, Samuel the prophet, go tell Saul his days are over. Days of kings as being king is over. So Saul comes and confronts, Shmuel comes and confronts Saul. And he says to him, he gives him a speech, and in the speech there is what looks on the surface to be a kind of contradiction. First he says, uses the verb nachem, nun ches mem. And he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is nachem that he made you king. Now sometimes they translate that as regret. That's definitely wrong. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't make mistakes that he has to regret. That doesn't happen. But something's changed. He ordered you to be king, and now he's no longer continuing with that. And then Shmuel says to Shaul, he's given the kingdom to somebody else, and don't try to change it because God is not man that he should be nachem. So the reader says, now let's get this straight. You told me God was at Nachem that Shaul should be king, and therefore changed, and no longer supporting him as king. And he's giving it to somebody else, and don't try to change that because God is not Nachem. Only people are Nachem, God isn't Nachem. But you yourself just said he is Nachem. And that verb is used in the book of Genesis with respect to the generation of the flood. It says that he made them. So Rashi over there explains what nachem means. Nachem means you have a goal that you're trying to achieve, and you have a means by which you're trying to achieve the goal, and then you change the means. You discard one means, and you adopt another means. That doesn't mean the choice of the means for the first period was wrong. The choice of the first means was right for the first period, and now the period has changed, and now a different means is appropriate. That's why regretting is a very terrible translation. Regretting would mean, I wish I hadn't done it in the first period. That's not what the word means, and certainly not appropriate to state about the Creator. But conditions have changed, and conditions require a change means. So, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying to tell Shaul, I now have changed the means that I'm going to use. You were the means to a certain end, and now I'm stopping using you as a means to that end. Fine. Someone else is going to be king. For him, there won't be any nachem. Why? Because his being king isn't a means to some other end. His being king is the end, or part of the end itself. It's not subject to its utility and functionality in producing some other consequence. This is King David. King David is the founder of the Davidic kingdom, and Mashiach is going to be a descendant of his. So this is part of the non-negotiable final picture of the world. And therefore Nachem doesn't apply. Because Nachem only applies to something whose character is a means. So here's the Kodesh Baruch Hu on record. You can, so to speak, negotiate and change position on a means, but you can't negotiate or change position on an end. Maybe that's the rule. You have in your life means and ends. It's a little tricky to figure out sometimes. Some of the things you think of as ends are really themselves means to further ends, but okay, we're not going to solve all the problems tonight. But you imagine that you have things that are identified as means and things that are identified as ends. And the rule would be, when you're in a conflict with somebody else, and it's suggested that you should compromise and share the outcome, you say, well, if it means that I'm going to negotiate away some of the means that I was using and switch them for other means, that's okay, that I can do. But not the ends. If it's the ends, I've got to hold that tight and say, no, I'm not giving that up at all. But you see, for a human being, that doesn't work well, because the reason you were invested in the means is that's how you were getting the ends, isn't it? Otherwise, you wouldn't have had any interest in that means at all. It's a means to one of your ends. And often, sometimes people might just make miscalculations, but often, to compromise on the means automatically that you're compromising on the end. My end is to have a first-class education. It's just very expensive. I've earned money, but now there's an attack on my money. Should I compromise? Okay, so you won't go to the University of Michigan, which hasn't yet been convicted of some horrible crime. That's why I didn't say Harvard. Maybe I'm just ignorant. So, you can go to Queens Community College. Again, education, it's not going to be the quality that you... Wait a minute.
Might be better
than Harvard, that's right, nowadays. So I didn't say Harvard. So if you compromise on money, which is a means, you may thereby automatically be compromising on an end. It's very difficult in human life to separate compromising on means versus compromising on ends. And furthermore, let's consider if you have two courses of action, and let's say you have a certain end. People have more than one end often. There's an end called A. And one course of action, and these are only two courses of action open to you. One course of action, you will achieve none of A at all. Another course of action, you will achieve 50% of A. And let's suppose your expectation is that's the last chance you're going to have at A, and you'll never have a chance to do any more. Should you say, since I'm not compromising, I'm not giving up on any of A, I'll choose the option where I accomplish none of A? Would that be the right outcome? That's not obvious. If it's 0A or 50% A and A is an end, you could easily make the case that 50% A is better than none. Is that a compromise? You can call it a compromise or not call it a compromise. I don't know. But the point is, it's certainly the better choice. So now it's going to be kind of difficult to know when you can compromise and when you can't compromise. Let's take mitzvos. Someone puts a gun at someone's head and says, eat a cheeseburger, or violate Shabbos, or whatever it is, or I'll kill you. What should he do? What are we talking about, Rabbi? These are the mitzvos of the Torah. That's clearly an end, the end. The part of the end. You can't compromise on mitzvos. Creator of the universe told you to do it. I hear that. It's just wrong. Because the same creator of the universe told you, eat the cheeseburger, violate Shabbos, and live. There are only three categories of transgressions for which, if you're challenged in this way, you have to die rather than live, and they're not included. So then you say, oh, I understand. It's because the mitzvah of living is more important than the violation of Shabbos or the violation of kashrus. Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. But then how would you know? When you have conflicts between your ends, how would you know which way to go? When to go? According to Rambam, anyway, if the Torah tells you to violate rather than die, you must violate. You may not die. If you choose to die, you're guilty of suicide. So it's not as if it's a floating system, and you can so choose which way you want to go. No, it's a dictated system, and it tells you under these conditions you can't compromise with life. And when it comes, let's say, with respect to murder, there you can't compromise with murder, and you have to die rather than violate the mitzvah of murder. In neither case can you compromise. Question is which way to go, and it's very, very difficult to tell. So I think that the issue is a very subtle and difficult issue. The broad perspective is to look at the consequences, and it's important to know that you have to take into account the long-term consequences. I saw a quotation. I don't think it was published, so I'm not going to say the name of the person, but this happened probably 50 years ago. A 14-year-old girl decided that she wanted to keep Shabbos, and her parents said, in our home, you will not keep Shabbos. Not that we won't join you, that's certainly out of the question, but you won't keep Shabbos here. So she had correspondence with one of the then internationally famous decisors, asking what to do. Now, of course, many of you know that according to the strict halacha, parents can't tell you to violate any law of the Torah. They don't have the authority to do that. Okay? They don't have the authority to do that. But he said, don't keep Shabbos. Not because he thought they had the authority to tell you not to keep Shabbos, but because if you set up a bitter battle between a 14-year-old and her parents, it's very likely she's going to lose. And then her whole project of becoming frum could very well be lost. And this is not an exaggeration, because when I was in university and I was exploring Judaism at first, there was a small group of us, maybe 15, 20. One of the boys who was involved, parents got wind of it, and they took him out of college for a year. They sent him to a psychiatrist, and when he came back, he was fixed. He didn't talk to us, nothing to do with us, The psychiatrist fixed him. Whether he remained on drugs, or whether he hypnotized him, or whatever it was, he certainly brainwashed him. So parents can do that. So here, this decider had to make up a long-term decision. What's in this 14-year-old's best spiritual interest? And decided that the project of Shabbos would come later. So you do have to take into account the consequences, and you have to look down the road. I'm mentioning this in part because of the terrible situation in the land of Israel right now, where the question of compromise, what kind of compromise to make, and is it appropriate, and on whose cheshbon, and who's losing out in the compromise that you are you making a compromise for him? That also has certain odd consequences. And then, of course, if you're an elected authority in a democracy, you have the authority because you're taking into account, presumably, the interests of the whole nation, which weigh heavily against the interests of any particular individual or any particular group. But then you have to know what the interests are. It's a very complicated, detailed situation. What I'm pointing out is that the call to compromise isn't inappropriate in general. It's not a wrong thing to consider. But what you're compromising on and why, and what the alternatives are, have to be taken very carefully into account. So, for example, when a great rabbi is captured and held for ransom, should you ransom him or shouldn't you ransom him? And the general rule, although it's discussion and exception, the general rule is if the price goes beyond a certain amount, don't ransom him because you'll encourage more kidnappings. So, what's he worth? Well, there's what he's worth, and there's what's going to happen to other rabbis who are also worth. Excuse me, when you ransom him, the result's going to be that other people are going to be kidnapped. What about them? Don't take them into account. Why? Because he's your father? The halacha is not biased for you or against you. The halacha is biased in favor of doing what's best for what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants for the community. So, that being the case, the compromise there is limited in that way. If by ransoming him you're going to encourage more kidnappings, then you don't do it. Of course, you don't measure in money the value of really any strong Talmid Chacham, and certainly not one who's one of the Gottleib Ador, but the halacha requires you to take into account what the future consequences will be. Now, another aspect of this, which makes it much more complicated, this depends upon how old you are, to a certain extent. You talk about your goals, your ends, the things which for you are means. How stable are you? You're, let me say this in the appropriate, awed tone of voice, you're 24 years old. Wow. And you're going to consider whether you should compromise on your goals, your ends, or your means. Do you have any clue who you'll be at 35? Maybe by that time, your goals and ends will change. Maybe through greater life experience, greater study, greater understanding, greater consideration, you'll think the goals and ends that I had at 24 were immature. So then, if you're thinking about compromising, how strongly should you weigh the ends that you have at 24? When there's some reasonable chance by 35 you won't have those ends anymore. That means a note of caution has to be inserted. The compromise at 24 and compromise at 65 aren't the same thing. And therefore, a 24-year-old can't learn from a 65-year-old. Because when a 65-year-old stands on his principles, he's been working a long time on those principles. 24-year-old can't say, I learned from my 65-year-old grandfather to stand on your principles. So I stand on my principles. The lesson is not direct. The 24-year-old would probably do better on standing on the principles of Rashi, or standing on the principles of Rav Hirsch, or standing on the principles of the Baal Shem Tov than he would on standing on his own principles. Because when he's older and more mature and better educated, he's much more likely to have their goals than the goals that he has now at 24. So that's another wrinkle in the kind of considerations that have to be taken into account. Now there's another aspect to this which is also very important. When we talk about right and wrong, we naturally think, and we're influenced in this by the environment, I think, to a great extent, that the emphasis in ethics, in university, and in the literature, and in societal decisions, the emphasis is always on what do you do and what effect does it have on the people around you. What this obscures is the fact that every action you take has an effect on you also. When you act, you either reinforce certain parts of your personality or you weaken certain parts of your personality. And that means your character changes. And the effect on the change of your character is also a moral effect. Because one dimension of morality is called virtue. Being a virtuous person. And that's a matter of your internal state. Being righteous, being fair, being just is a matter of how your actions affect others. Being virtuous depends upon what your character is. From the point of view of the Torah, both are morally and spiritually important. And if you look at the situation, I think even without the Torah informing you, you can see that there's some aspect of this that has to play a role. Let me give you an example. I have a friend, Fred, and poor Fred steals. That's what he does. He steals. I mean, he does other things also, but when he's in stores and nobody's looking, he takes things and puts them in his pocket. Today, you don't have to worry. You could be, the cameras can be watching, and they'll be there, and you'll do it anyway. And for less than $950 in the state of California, they can't stop you because the prosecutors will not prosecute you for stealing. Okay, enough politics. So Fred steals, and I've talked to Fred about it. He steals, and it bothers me. Now, I happen to know that Fred's going to Beijing on business. So I said, listen, Fred, in China it's different. There are hidden cameras everywhere. There are plainclothes policemen everywhere. And if you steal, they chop off your hand. That's what they do in China. So I recommend that while you're in China, you keep your hands in your pockets. And for some unaccountable reason, he trusts me. So he goes to Beijing, and he keeps his hands in his pockets. He's stuck there for negotiations, and after 9 months in Beijing, he dies. The last 9 months of his life, he doesn't steal. Has Fred become virtuous? Is he a saint?
He's changed.
Oh, he's changed, all right. But I didn't ask, did he change? I asked, has he become virtuous? Has he become a saint? Well, he's not stealing, but he's only not stealing because he's scared. He still doesn't think there's anything wrong with stealing. There's nothing wrong with getting caught and having your hand chopped off. That's definitely wrong. But the stealing for him is still morally neutral, perfectly okay. That's not called virtue. Virtue doesn't mean doing the right thing. Virtue means roughly doing the right thing because it's right. Because you're committed to the right values. And because you're training yourself to live your life in terms of those right values. So we see that a person whose actions would be fine still isn't a moral ideal. There's a question of his character. So now let's go back to the idea of compromise. What kind of person seeks compromise? What kind of person is willing or even eager to compromise? What are his values? What are his priorities? Maybe there's a value in compromise because of the kind of person that it reinforces, the kind of character traits, mitos, that it reinforces in a person. It's what psychologists call agreeableness. I want people to feel good. I want people to feel comfortable. I want people's lives to go well. I'm happier when other people's lives go well. If you're like that, that's good. You're invested in other people. You think other people are important. That's right, they are important. You think that it's a value to help people's lives flourish. It is. It is. The grand proof of this is that's all HaKadosh Baruch Hu is doing. All he's doing is trying to enable human lives to flourish. So it must be a good project. It must be an important project. The whole universe was created for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to express his benevolence, his giving of good, and everything that happens in the world is designed and managed to maximize the amount of good that he can give to people. So if compromise is part of your sense of commitment to people and wanting things to go well in their lives, that's definitely a very good type of character to have. And if compromise reinforces that, then that, in this respect, is definitely a good thing to do. That doesn't take precedence over the impact it has on other people and everything else, but it is a value that it has. And now let's push this a little bit deeper. So I want other people's lives to go well. What does it mean for them to go well? For them to be happy? For them to get what they want? Desire satisfaction versus pleasure? Both of them? Is that what it means for them to go well? Let's see. Does the Torah practice capital punishment? Yes, it does. Well, for 1,500 years it was in practice. From the time of Moses until the end of the Sanhedrin, until the time the Sanhedrin was moved from its base in the Lichkal Gazis, any 23-member court in the world could try cases of capital punishment. So, and the Mishnah in Mako says that one of the Tanaim says, if I had been there, they never would have done. But that means they did, and it happened, and so it definitely happened. And we are looking forward when the Mashiach comes to restoring the courts and the justice and the capital punishment and all the rest. Now, how do we explain the appropriateness of capital punishment? Well, the simplistic bottom line is this person is better off dead than alive. He's better off dead than alive. So, if I want his life to go well, I should arrange for his capital punishment. It's not that Sanhedrin allows itself to be viciously cruel to people because they did bad things. No, the importance of the Torah is that everything is directed at the good. So when a person is executed, so for example, you have Ben Sora Mora, the rebellious son. The Mishnah tells us that he's executed before he commits the crime that's in his future, which would have been utterly damning for him. So we say, not living the rest of his life is better than living it, because had he continued to live it, then he would have done something much worse. Was the destruction of the temple good for the Jewish people? One explanation of it is that having the temple gives you power. By the sacrifices you offer there and by the prayers that you utter there, you have a tremendous amount of power in investing how the world shall run. If you're using it wrongly, you're better off without it because you're using it for destruction and you'll be more guilty. When you take matches away from a 4-year-old, are you making his life worse? Well, he cries. He wants to play with fire. But I think you're making his life better because with the matches, he's going to be worse off. So when you talk about compromise and you talk about wanting things to go well with other people, be very careful to define what is it for things to really go well with those people. And it may be quite different from what they think. I shouldn't say think. What they want or what they enjoy. You certainly don't want what a 7-year-old wants or enjoys to determine what happens to him. The vast majority of those things aren't going to make his life better. Some people at 37 are just as ignorant as 7-year-olds. Take, for example, I read about a case like this, of a drug addict who's been in detoxification twice, and twice he's relapsed. And now there's a new program for people coming from his former program, and it's been tried over the last 3 years, and over 3 years, its success rate is 82%. You say to him, here's your chance. This is designed dafka for people like you. He says, I can't do it. I can't do it, Rabbi. You're not an addict. You don't know what it's like. I just can't do it. But this will save your life, as you are with your addiction. You're going to die in the next 5 years. I know, Rabbi. I know. I just can't do it. Right? So I don't know. Maybe you should knock him out, ship him there, put him in handcuffs, and force him to stay there. Wouldn't that be better for his life than continue in a sense of despair in his addiction and dying in less than 5 years? So, the desire to help other people's lives go well forces you to think deeply about what really is better or worse for their lives. Now, there too, compromise will play a role. You know, if you know that X would be good for his life, and right now anyway, he's only prepared to take on half of X, there's no reason not to compromise at least temporarily. And if that's all you get, you got half of X. That definitely is going to improve his situation. So there, the compromise is definitely appropriate. I think working this last point in reverse, I don't think I'm going to quit. There are certain sort of basic attitude towards life and basic approaches to life, and sometimes they're the result of certain political systems or some philosophical systems, and although they're not universally true, they're very largely true, and I think that they should be taken into account when thinking about the rights and wrongs, ups and downs, better and worse of different systems. And the system of rights has, I think, a significant downside. Because the person who believes in rights and preaches rights and talks about defending rights, his basic attitude towards other people is, don't get in my way. Don't take something from me. Don't limit me. Don't push me around. It's an aggressive, defensive attitude. Always looking not to be the victim, not to be hurt, not to be cheated. One of the state flags in the United States, the picture on of the flag is a snake, and the legend on the flag is, don't tread on me. Don't step on me, because I'll kill you if you step on me. Emphasizing rights at the basis of your morality and the basis of your social and political morality leads to this kind of aggressive, defensive attitude, belligerent attitude, which I think is really quite seriously negative, quite seriously injurious. An alternative basis for your interpersonal and social morality is the basis of obligation. What do I owe you? What am I obligated to help you or service you in, to promote in you? Instead of protecting myself against your encroachment on my freedom, I ask, what obligations do I have with my resources to help you? That puts a person in the frame of mind of, I have certain resources and other people may need them, and it is a positive good to use my resources to help other people. What a different attitude towards society, towards life, towards the interactions in which you come. Somebody comes and he tries to cheat you and so on and so on. Here's the rights attitude. Get out of my way. I'll call the police, or I'll do something else. Nobody steps on my toes. The obligations attitude would be, why is he trying to cheat me? Why is he doing that? Why is he trying to step on my toes? Here's a rule that I think is true, and it's very important to keep in mind. A person who causes pain is in pain. A person who deliberately causes pain to somebody else, why would you do that? If you were happy, if you were satisfied, if you had everything that you really need, what would be in it for you to cause somebody else pain? What would you get out of it? No, but somebody hurt you and you want to get back. Or you feel defensive, you feel inadequate because you can't control your circumstances. So you control other people because otherwise you feel that you're a failure and so on and so on. The person's in pain. So the person starts with obligations. I wonder what I could do to relieve his pain. But get out of my way and don't try to cheat me. But he's in. What can I do for him to make him feel better? I think that's a much healthier attitude towards another person than the defensive, aggressive, don't step on my toes. I don't say that's a reason to discard rights and to adopt obligations instead. I was very careful with my vocabulary. If you're watching the video, you can play it back. All I said was this is a demerit in the rights system. A person may say, thank you for pointing that out, Rabbi. I agree with you. And since it is a demerit, I'm going to work to try to soften that consequence, to counteract that consequence. I still believe in rights that they're fundamental, but you've pointed out that it has a negative side. I'll try to work to improve that negative side, which would be a perfectly adequate reaction to what I'm saying. Just have to be aware of it. And to have a rights system without obligations seems to me to be very, very questionable. and although I'm not going to do it now, I used to do this decades ago. You could have an obligation system without rights, because you can turn obligations into pseudo rights. And anyway, my point is that the idea of compromise becomes an expression of a certain attitude towards people and towards life, which is a very valuable attitude. With or without, analyzing all the details of how it's to be done in practice. Negotiators. That's what negotiators do. Negotiators find a way to speak to both sides so that each side feels satisfied and feels that it's receiving a worthwhile situation by agreeing to work with the other side. That kind of negotiation is very valuable. That's Yoatzenu. Those are our advisors, who are the first step application of our Shoftenu, who are our judges. Okay, some thoughts on